Chapter 27. Why it took Mama so long to solve our problem with the traction company, I'm not sure, except that maybe she was still occupied with the fall garden cleanup. Then came the dead of winter, and we were arriving at home at all hours of the evening on the verge of pneumonia because of the mean old conductors. Our teachers were complaining that we weren't getting our homework done, much less our schoolwork, and the neighborhood kids were saying, "It's no peaceful now that the Bigham girls don't live here anymore." So desperate had we become that we no longer spent all of our surplus cash on candy. Instead, we saved to buy the occasional big man token, so we could arrive home in time to get a few hours sleep before the cock crowed. The solution was on its way, although we didn't recognize it at first. It began at breakfast. Dor was half asleep on my shoulder, and I was half asleep on Floor's shoulder. Floor was sitting up straight, tending to her big sister responsibilities, begging Papa for money. "We have to have money to buy new swim hats. They split in the seams, Papa, honest." This was one of our biggest expenses. We went through swim hats like Popeye went through spinach. Papa rebutted, "If you let me give you a pig shave, you wouldn't need hats." Then Mama brought the oatmeal mush to the table and uttered the words that were to change our lives. "I have to go over town for some notions, bias tape, sewing machine needles. I'll pick you up after school. I can shop while you're swimming and then I'll bring you home." That worked well. The next morning she said, "I have to go over town for sewing machine oil." That worked well too. The morning after, before she could say anything, Papa said, "Why don't you make a list?" The next morning, Mama sat down at the table with her list. "I have to go over town to exchange the bias tape." Papa never seemed to question why Mama had this sudden need for notions, even though they were filling up all the empty drawer space in the house. If he did, he never let on. Every so often, however, he would say, "Since you're going to be over near the Pike Place Market today anyway, maybe you can pick me up some Limburger cheese." It seemed that women's liberation had proved itself again, and all the Bighams began living happily ever after. We three small potatoes recovered from pneumonia. Dor and I spent our streetcar money on candy. Floor spent hers on lipstick. Mama got enough needles and thread to last into the next millennium. And Papa had so much Limburger cheese that Mama's clothesline was beginning to sag. The only problem with being chauffeured to the pool was that we were deprived of the opportunity to play hooky and go to the movies. Of course, we hadn't done this often. Our desperate financial situation added to the good communication between home and pool. "Hope it isn't catching," the coaches would say, even before Mama could speculate on our whereabouts. Papa had the answer on the tip of his tongue. "You're damn right it's catching. They'll catch hell when they get home." We had loved the movies since the time that Papa and Mama had first taken us to see Harold Lloyd, who spent most of the movie hanging from the outside of a building. Papa explained, "He can't ride a horse, and people want something more exciting than boys kissing girls." Although the movies of our youth were silent films, the theater was far from quiet. An organ played constantly, interpreting the emotion of the moment, while voices of inquiring children echoed from every corner. "What did she say, Daddy?" Papa, a somewhat reluctant interpreter, spelled out a solution. "When you go to school and learn to read, I won't have to tell you what they say." Floor answered, "I can read, but I can't read the movie star's words." Mama explained, "Their words are different than what children encounter in their school readers." Floor said, "I'm going to invent a phonograph to put on the stage to make the movie stars talk." "Yeah, and we can call them the talkies," I said. "I can hardly wait," Papa said. As soon as Floor and I were old enough, we were allowed to go with the neighborhood kids to the theater in Hillman City, where on Friday nights they showed serials, masterpieces of horror, with runaway horses, trains falling off high trestles, and canoes being dashed to pieces over Niagara Falls. During all of this, the piano was banging fortissimo, and the poor, frightened children were screaming at the top of their lungs. Just when the heroine was hanging from a tiny branch over a pool of ferocious alligators, the screen flashed the burning question, "Will the handsome prince get there in time to rescue our beautiful Etheline?" It certainly gave one something to ponder until next Friday night. If Etheline doesn't get rescued, wasn't she only getting her just desserts? She'd already been rescued 6 times in 6 weeks. Why didn't she stay home and work on her hope chest? Etheline didn't have anything on us. As we left the theater in the lingering light of the summer evening, the boys were filled with jungle fever, ready to try out all of their newly learned antics. Instead of starting down Rainier Avenue, the route agreed upon by their parents, they would head toward Chink Hill, named, according to Mama, because of the multitude of Chinese pheasants brought there by Chinese immigrants. According to the boys, this vast wooded area was a hideout for Chinese bandits. They have big, long, curly knives and they kill girls, Dunny said. And they chop them up for chop suey, Port added. Our great dilemma was, should we go by Rainier Avenue, alone and defenseless against murderers and rapists, or should we follow the boys over the steep terrain full of underbrush and sword ferns, which loomed as sinister in our minds as Seward Park Pen? Poor Fleur. She always had to make these weighty decisions. She usually decided to follow the boys, warning me, "For gosh sakes, don't tell Mama, she'll never let us go to another movie." Although there were no streetlights or houses to run into in case of an emergency, the trip was a shortcut, only about a mile as the crow flies, compared to over 2 miles by Rainier Avenue. Since we had to go by land and not air, however, the trip could be lengthened considerably, depending on how many detours we were forced to take because of boys springing out from the bushes with sword fern swords and Tarzan yells, or because of the screeching of Chinese pheasants when we stepped into their nests. Why hadn't I stayed home and worked on my hope chest? Strangely enough, by the next Friday, Flora and I were gung-ho for more. Who's afraid of a big, bad movie? Turns out I was. One night, Papa read about a movie that had become an instant success. The newspaper described it as the horror movie to end all horror movies. What's it about? Flora asked. Mama read the article. It's about a doctor who made a man out of nuts and bolts, and the man turned into a horrible monster. Oh, let's go and see that, Dor said enthusiastically. It's nothing for children. In fact, children are not allowed. Papa was appalled with the reports. It says here that they have to hire nurses at the theater because women faint dead away. Dor was listening intently. Then do they have to bury them? Bury who? Papa asked. Bury the women that fainted dead away. While Papa was trying to explain dead away, Mama was reading further. Women fall right out of their seats. Gosh, that keeps the nurses busy putting women back in their seats, I said. What happens if the nurses faint? Dor asked. Nurses aren't allowed to faint, Flora explained. But aren't nurses women? Dor asked. At least not on the job. Nurses aren't allowed to faint, Papa said. Although you're right, Dorothy. Nurses are women. Papa ended the conversation with his legal opinion. Frankenstein should be banned from the theaters, period. With that said, it was never dreamed that any of the Bigham family would go, except by Dorothy. She started begging Fleur, "Won't you take Franny and me to see Frankenstein?" Fleur was horrified. "You know Papa would have a conniption." "But Papa doesn't have to know," Dor said. "But he would. Papa always knows. Besides, I don't want to see Frankenstein. It's ghastly, and I don't want to hear another word about it." I threw in my vote with Florence. I had no desire to see the horror movie to end all horror movies. As inevitably happens in fate, everything came together one day, when Mama hadn't been able to drive us to the pool. Dor and I were on the streetcar clanging through the slum area, when Dor jumped up. "Franny, there it is." I looked, and blazing on the theater marquee was that frightening word, Frankenstein. Dor began pulling on me. "Come on, Franny, let's go." "Not to that movie. Papa forbade it. And not to that theater. That's where the bums sleep all day. Mrs. Williams says so." Dorothy dug into her pocket, pointing out that there was a miracle involved. She had enough money to pay for the tickets. "It's the birthday money that I got from Uncle Doc. He said to buy something that I really, really want, and I really, really want to go see Frankenstein." I had to admit that spending birthday money without even a suggestion from anyone else was a sacred trust, even more of a trust than being responsible for little sisters. I gave in. How we managed to get by the ticket taker, I don't know. But I suspect that cheap movie houses were eager for any money, no matter how tainted. The Depression, you know. The minute we stepped into the dark aisle, I knew that it was a mistake. The whole theater smelled like the Brown House from down the street on a hot summer night. The only light was being cast from the big screen. It was difficult pushing our way into our seats. Everyone seemed to be in a state of unconsciousness. "I wonder where the nurses are," Dor whispered. "Sit down and shut up," came a rough voice from out of the dark. As soon as we found 2 vacant seats, we sat down and shut up. We clutched our purses and huddled together. Our eyes no sooner focused on the screen than we were both shaking violently. The guy next to me aroused himself long enough to slur, "Shot parocking de boat." The smell was so bad that I was holding my nose, and that may account for why I had a sudden rush of morality. "Come on, Dor, we've got to go." Dor was in such a state I could hardly jar her loose from her seat. Finally, I got her to the lobby. We took a few minutes to regain our composure before going out into the street. Gradually, though, we began to feel more normal, and our moral fiber and courage returned. It was, after all, only a movie. We had probably already seen the worst part. "It can't get any worse," Dor said. This time we were determined to find better seats, close to the nurses who were waiting to revive fainted women. We couldn't find the nurses, and we were wrong about the movie. It got worse. Before long, Dor screamed, "Franny, I want to go." I was glad she had waited until an especially scary episode, when everyone who had the slightest degree of consciousness was screaming too. Up we got, and left again. As soon as we were in the lights of the lobby, Dor began moaning again, this time about how much money we would waste if we left. It was my birthday money, and this is something that I really, really wanted. These excursions might have gone on forever, if the usher hadn't become annoyed, and told us that if we went out one more time, we would have to stay out. We went back in, very determined. This time we managed to stay for about half an hour, due in large part to the fact that we kept our eyes closed. It was the smell that finally overcame us. We exhaled one last time and left for good. We had a long wait for the streetcar, which was scary in the slum area, but it gave us time to manufacture a good story. The streetcar bumped to a halt. We hopped on, dropped our school tokens in the fare box, and very sweetly addressed the conductor. "We're late going home because our mean old teacher gave us an assignment to go see." The conductor was obviously a member of the Where Have I Heard This Story Before club. "I know. The teacher ordered you to see Frankenstein so that you could make a book report." Impatiently, he closed the door and stepped on the clangor. The other passengers were impatient too. "Sit down and shut up." We sat down, but we didn't shut up. Dor whispered, "Maybe if we go see it in a theater where there isn't so much bad breathing and snoring. I wonder what happens at the end." We never found out, but as Floor had predicted, Papa did. How? We never knew for sure, but I think it's because when Mama was making our Halloween costumes, Dor said, "I want one like Frankenstein with bolts sticking out of my head."